Perfecto. 3, 2. Ok. Bueno, muchas gracias. Bueno, buenos días aquí en la Ciudad de México, buenas tardes en Europa, buenos días muy temprano en Tijuana, de donde nos acompaña Martín. Me da mucho gusto recibirlos en esta nueva sesión del Seminario Interinstitucional de Historia Internacional que organizamos colegas del Colegio México, la UNAM, el CIDE y la CAFOSCARI. Hoy tenemos el gusto de recibir a Sara Bellows-Blakely con una presentación muy provocadora sobre redes de mujeres, de activismo a propósito de los derechos de las niñas. Entonces, bueno, me da mucho gusto recibirla. La voy a presentar. Ella es investigadora postdoctoral y profesora de Historia Intelectual Global en la Universidad Libre de Berlín. Obtuvo su doctorado y maestría en Historia Africana en la Universidad de Washington en San Luis.
¿Cómo estás? Buenos días.
Actualmente está terminando el manuscrito de un libro titulado Girl Power, The Birth of Girl Focused Development from Nairobi, que está muy asociado a la plática que dará hoy. El libro se hace en 2 años de investigación oral y de archivo a tiempo completo en Nairobi, sobre todo, pero también en París, Washington, Nueva York. Ha publicado artículos en Gender and History, en The Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Women in Africa, y está trabajando en un artículo para The American Historical Review. Martín H. González Romero, quien hará el comentario a la presentación, es investigador interdisciplinario en Historia de Género y las Sexualidades. Es doctor en Historia y maestro en Estudios de Género por el Colegio de México. Sus temas de investigación incluyen la historia reciente de México, la revolución sexual en la Ciudad de México, la historia del movimiento LGBT más mexicano y la masculinidad moderna en el México del siglo XIX. Tanto su tesis doctoral como algunos artículos han obtenido diversos premios y actualmente es investigador en el Colegio de la Frontera Norte en la ciudad de Tijuana. Entonces, bueno, pues sin más, le doy la palabra a Sara. Whenever you want to start, Sarah. Thank you for being here.
Muchas gracias, Anna. And hello, and it's a pleasure and honor to speak with all of you today. I'm really thrilled to be here. So I'd like to thank, in English this time, Ana Sofia Rodriguez Everett for inviting me to speak, and Dr. Martín González for commenting. And last but not least, thanks to all of you, the viewers, for tuning in. My talk today is about the historical growth of girl-focused economic development programming and the silencing and erasures that went hand in hand with this history. In 2008, a short film was posted on the internet. The film began, "The world is a mess. What if there was an unexpected solution that could turn this sinking ship around? Would you even know it if you saw it? It's not the internet. It's not science. It's not the government. It's not money. It's a girl." The video was released by a project called The Girl Effect, which was a collaboration between the Nike Foundation, the United Nations, and Warren Buffett's Novo Foundation. Within 2 years, this video attracted 10 million viewers, according to an article that Nicholas Kristof wrote for the New York Times. This video was not alone. The Girl Effect is symbolic of what some scholars and commenters, including Heather Switzer, have called girls in development. A hallmark of girls in development is the idea that educating girls, promoting the human rights of girls, and more broadly empowering girls can solve poverty. Girls in development frameworks have been applied in different ways in various locations, but they've tended to target communities of people living in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. I'll add here that in this literature, and certainly in my own work, development is not a concept that I use normatively. It's a term used by the actors in this history. Over the past 15 years or so, a number of scholars have argued that girls in development and the types of girls' rights frameworks underpinning them are emblematic of neoliberal feminism. People like Farzana Shane, Emily Bent, and Navtej Purwell have critiqued the ways in which girls in development has devolved responsibility for solving poverty away from the level of the state and away from international economic and political systems onto the shoulders of girls and their families. In turn, these scholars have built on debates put forth by interdisciplinary feminist thinkers who've questioned how feminism came to be the handmaiden to capitalism, as Nancy Fraser so iconically put it. As a historian, my motivation coming into this project was that I wanted to know about the origins of these kinds of programs. Where did girls in development come from? How did this set of ideas become so dominant? How did it lead to various kinds of programming on multiple continents? Was it always neoliberal? Was it only neoliberal? These were the kinds of questions that I was asking. In the last 5 years, a few histories of girls in development from other scholars have begun to emerge. These analyses generally start with an endpoint. As I've done in this talk today, they begin with the dominant girl-focused economic frameworks in the early 20th century, and then they work backward to trace how these ideas internationalized. In the process, they've located the origins of girls in development within the usual suspects of neoliberal capitalism. Think the World Bank, the United States Agency for International Development. They examine these institutions' partial shift from women-focused development planning to girl-focused development planning in the 1990s. And then they explore how this logic diffused outward as an already intact system of thought to the rest of the world. This narrative of diffusion is very likely familiar to global and international historians of a variety of topics, from nationalism to human rights, liberalism, and capitalism. A set of ideas or policies originated in the global north, the west, or the metropole, depending on the study, and then it spread outward to the rest of the world. As scholars have recently shown with these other topics, the problem with this narrative, in addition to its embedded Eurocentrism, is that in the case of girls in development, it's both incomplete and inaccurate. Ashwini Tambe has started to flesh out histories of girls in development in less Eurocentric ways by tracing how the term the girl child became popularized within South Asian actors in the 1990s before it circulated globally. Building on Tambe's work, I trace an alternative genealogy of girls in development, and at the crux of it is this story. In September of 1995, nearly 50,000 people from 189 countries convened in Beijing, China, for the fourth and final United Nations World Conference on Women. Thousands of conference attendees were journalists who broadcast the convention's dramas to audiences around the world. Hillary Clinton gave an acclaimed speech on the importance of women's rights to human rights and economic growth. And as many scholars and activists have noted, the widely celebrated and commented upon conference outputs, which are called the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, set the blueprints for the linked movements for women's rights and economic development, not only in 1995, but well into our present moment. But the conference was not only a watershed moment for women's rights. In Beijing, a set of norms about the importance of promoting the rights of girls was also cemented. This occurred through the inclusion of a special section called Section L on the girl child in the Beijing Platform for Action. Among other things, the conference outputs focused on the capacity of girls to promote economic development and to fully participate in society as adults when freed from the burdens of supposed cultural and familial patriarchy. These norms that emerged in the Beijing Platform for Action would guide not only United Nations policymaking, but the work of actors around the world. While the last-minute inclusion of a special section on girls at the Fourth World Conference on Women was not solely responsible for making girls in development into a dominant logic, it represents a fundamental step in this process. But the solidification of girls in development as a mainstream part of international pursuits for women's rights and economic development was not a foregone conclusion. Initially, Section L on the girl child wasn't even going to be included in the Platform for Action. It didn't appear in an official draft of the conference outputs that were prepared by early 1995. And Linda Tarr Whalen, who was a delegate to the Beijing conference under the administration of US President Bill Clinton, wrote in 1995 that Section L on the girl child was included at the last minute due to its, quote, particular importance to African delegates. In reality, the girl child was belatedly written into the Beijing conference outputs because of a lobbying campaign. And it's this lobbying campaign that'll be the focus of the rest of my talk today. Who led the lobbying campaign? The campaign was primarily led by people at two institutions. The first was the United Nations Children's Fund, or UNICEF, and especially the branches of offices of UNICEF based in Nairobi, Kenya. The second was the African Women's Development and Communications Network, or FEMNET. FEMNET is a non-governmental organization. It was founded in Nairobi in 1988 by a group of women from across Africa. They explicitly conceived of FemNet as a Pan-African association whose main mission was to advocate around issues related to women and economic development. And they've had consultative status with the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, which is the body that's been responsible for organizing the UN World Conferences on Women. So in the late 1980s, members of UNICEF and FemNet began to work together. They collected data on the lived experiences of girls across East and Southern Africa, and they published these studies and organized a conference to discuss them in Gaborone, Botswana in 1992. They also wrote and published pamphlets of cartoons, poems, and short stories that put forth various ideas related to girls in development and that discussed the lives of girls in Africa and globally. They submitted reports on girls' rights and relationships to economic development as evidence at various UN planning committees, and they particularly mobilized before a planning meeting in New York City in the spring of 1995. There, the draft text of the Beijing Platform for Action was discussed and debated, and it was at this planning meeting in New York City where members of the lobbying campaign were so successful in advocating for the addition of Section L on the girl child in the final conference outputs. So I'll pause here and say it could be tempting to end the story if we bracket this question of neoliberal feminism. Doing so would leave us on a seemingly triumphant note. Recall that some of the questions guiding this research were, where did girls in development come from and how did it internationalize? Knowing that this lobbying campaign existed and that it was successful in writing a form of girls in development into the outputs of the final World Conference on Women completely turns existing Eurocentric frameworks of globalization on their heads. Here we have a set of ideas that was written into the text of a hugely influential United Nations summit, and that became a set of global norms in the process because of the work of people based in Nairobi. And a number of these people were self-described Pan-Africanist women. So on this level, we have a romantic, triumphant story of agency. And yet, this is also not the full story. As we already know, this history is not one of the mere diffusion of knowledge and policymaking about girls in development from the global north outward, but it's also not merely a romantic tale of resistance or one-dimensional agency from the global south. Anna Lowenhot-Singh and Antoinette Burton have used the term friction to describe the uneasy relationships that have often existed within global encounters and transnational alliances. Frictions have been simultaneously destructive and productive of new relationships and forms of action. The growth of girls in development through a particular focus on girls in poverty emerged from a lobbying campaign between FemNet and UNICEF that was structured as much by frictions and as much by vertical hierarchies as it was by horizontal cooperation and easy agreements. Financial and political realities within the campaign partially determined which ideas came out of it in the end. And one result was the stripping out of the conversation of socialist, Marxist, decolonial, anti-racist, and other frameworks that invoked girls in order to call for a restructuring of the global economic system from above. Whereas these calls helped to underpin the rise of early forms of girls in development in the late 1980s, by the time of the Beijing Conference on Women in 1995, neoliberal frameworks of girl power, of solving poverty and inequality from below without changing economic or political structures from above, and often under ongoing conditions of economic austerity like structural adjustment, dominated the conversation. To illustrate this point, I'll share a case study. This is a case study of knowledge suppression and of the deliberate non-circulation of certain epistemologies related to girls in development as people at UNICEF and FemNet work together to generate knowledge on the girl child and then internationalize it. In 1990, officials at UNICEF's Nairobi branch of offices commissioned a set of studies on the lived experiences of girls across East and Southern Africa. The studies collectively came to be known as the Girl Child Project. Among other things, they were intended to produce knowledge about girls' access to formal schooling. To carry out the project, staff at UNICEF partnered with FemNet. A team of East and Southern African researchers who were from the region collected data in 8 countries. FemNet staff were responsible for coordinating the project and compiling the country's studies into a final report, which UNICEF was then to publish. Maybe surprisingly to some of you watching this, maybe not, the findings of the 8 country studies showed that girls' access to primary education in East and Southern Africa varied, but it was almost equal to that of boys in a lot of the region. In Botswana, the study's co-authors found that more girls than boys were enrolled in primary schools. 51.5% of students nationally were girls in 1989, compared with 48.5% registered as boys. By the final year of primary education, this had widened to a 12 percentage point gap in favor of girls. In Rwanda, Madagascar, and Kenya, just under half, between about 49 and 49.8% of primary school students were reportedly girls in 1990. In Burundi, Mozambique, and Ethiopia, girls comprised between 40 and 45% of documented primary school students. In Somalia, girls reportedly fared the worst. They were about 1/3 of recorded elementary school pupils in 1985. Results for school performance and retention were similarly mixed, with girls reportedly outperforming and outlasting boys under certain metrics, and boys outperforming girls in others. Gaps in favor of boys became more evident as students progressed through secondary education and onto universities and technical schools. So these above statistics reflect some of the most distilled findings of the reports. They generated more than 500 pages of data, both qualitative and quantitative. And one of the most striking findings of the Girl Child Project is that the individual studies do not present a single cohesive narrative of girls' lived experiences or educational access across East and Southern Africa. The researchers found that a matrix of factors impacted girls' presence and performance in schools. Reading the reports, one might be hard-pressed to find a unifying experience of African girlhood beyond the fact that many girls in the region did indeed attend school. The study's authors did, however, mention a few driving causes when explaining variances in educational access and performance. They found that civil strife had recently occurred in every country examined except for Botswana. They noted that long-lasting wars strongly impacted the educational systems of the three countries with the lowest rates of female school enrollment, especially Somalia. Structural adjustment programs and neoliberal economic austerity measures often took center stage. In the 1980s, for example, the International Monetary Fund adjusted Somalia's debt through a series of structural adjustment programs that required decreased funding for public education. Crucially, the Girl Child Project found that girls' levels of educational access in Somalia coincided more closely with the level of state spending on education than they did with the actual violence of war. Femnet hired Anna Obura, a Nairobi-based consultant on gender and education, to write the final report that combined all 8 of the country's studies into one publication. And for me, this is where it gets really exciting in a disturbing way. Before UNICEF published the report, the document was edited. Someone, publicly available records don't indicate who, removed or reworked multiple sections. One section was deleted that explicitly named the global economic collapse, structural adjustment programs, and economic austerity for harming girls' educational aspects and increasing feminized poverty across Africa. Instead, the revised report blamed the failures of education-focused structural adjustment programs on allegedly short-sighted and incompetent African leaders. The altered report that UNICEF published added language blaming gender-based educational disparities on the fact that structural adjustment programs were incomplete, that rather than being harmful, they were ineffective because they didn't go far enough in reducing state spending. The revised report that UNICEF published similarly erased sections on gender divisions of labor and the complexity of girls' and women's lives. One section of the original draft report that Femnet commissioned reprinted a quotation from the Kenya case study. And this section, in turn, mirrored language from a UNICEF publication from 1990. The Kenya report read, quote, "Women and girls in particular continue to suffer subordinate status vis-a-vis men and boys in all societies." So Obura reprinted this quotation in the final draft report, and she agreed that patriarchy was indeed universal in East and Southern Africa. But she connected the roots of universal patriarchy to gendered labor divides under capitalism. She wrote that oppression was due to girls' disadvantages in, quote, "finding an occupation and a cash income," end quote, as future women. She then argued that the 8 countries' studies showed that the influences of Western ideology were largely to blame. In traditional society, she wrote, these are her words now, African women built houses, acted as doctors and healers, and occupied positions of religious authority. Obura cited the country's studies to argue that it was the influence of constraining Western attitudes towards women's labor that curtailed African girls' and women's economic power. Nevertheless, she argued, the modern African woman continued to perform a variety of roles that gave her more power and flexibility than the Western woman. According to Obura, the prevalence of Eurocentric scholarship, particularly through colonial anthropology, had distorted understandings of African traditions. She argued that this Eurocentrism erased knowledge of the power that many African women had and continued to wield, even if it was not properly compensated under existing labor markets. Of course, the version of the report that UNICEF published reworked that section also. It reprinted the excerpts that described patriarchy as universal. However, it then erased the segments of the study that partially located the roots of this universal discrimination within Africa on gendered labor divides under capitalism and the legacies of colonialism. The version that UNICEF published deleted Obura's lengthy discussion of how diverse African girls and women's lived experiences were, particularly compared to what she called Western women. And instead, the altered published study discussed factors influencing girls' discrimination at the level of the family. It particularly blamed parents for preventing girls from going to school. The altered report then added another sentence condemning the, quote, traditional status of women for harming girls and women's well-being. Other sections of the final study that UNICEF published continued this trend. The findings that girls attended primary schools at higher rates than boys in Botswana and at nearly the same rate in a number of other countries surveyed were downplayed. The revised final report removed dozens of pages containing data specifying how varied girls' realities were across the region and detailing their outperformance over boys in certain areas. And finally, the revised report inserted sections praising UNICEF's work in children's education and healthcare, and it added the UNICEF logo to every page. UNICEF published and disseminated the altered version of the report in 1992. So at this point, some of you might be wondering, how did Femnet's members respond to this altering of the report? Maybe you're even having fantasies of this big call out moment. And the answers that I have probably won't fully satisfy you. Archival silences abound here. No publicly available information that I found contained a direct response to the revisions. But Femnet's public advocacy of the time did contain carefully worded denunciations of unequal relationships between international institutions, donors, and African NGOs. It often situated these critiques in a context in which Femnet's leaders felt caught between donors and the Kenyan government. For example, a printed conversation between Njoki Wainaina, who was one of Femnet's founders, and Femnet staff member Esther Kemweru appeared in an issue of Femnet News from 1994. This was 2 years after UNICEF published the Altered Girl Child Project findings. In the conversation, Kemweru brought up the disproportionate impact of structural adjustment programs on women and especially on the education of girls. In response, Wainaina reportedly said, quote, "It is real, so real that it is indeed painful. I'm afraid that NGOs have been known to go along with what governments and donors want." She said that alliances between local NGOs and national governments in Africa could help NGO staff members more effectively advocate in relation to international donors and institutions. When Kemweru then asked about potential alliances like this between NGOs such as Femnet and the government of Kenya, Wainaina responded, "I cannot comment. What I can say is that Kenya is not mentioned as a country that will support NGOs." To put this in context, at the time, the government of Kenyan President Daniel Arap Moi was under increasing pressure to democratize. The government was known for imprisoning, torturing, and disappearing NGO leaders and other political activists. In 1992, for example, police broke into the home of Wangari Maathai, the prominent women's rights advocate, environmentalist, and Nairobi-based NGO founder. She was jailed and then charged with spreading malicious rumors, sedition, and treason. It was in this context that Wainaina very carefully criticized donors for pushing particular narratives related to girls' lived experiences in education while referencing Femnet members' mistrust of the state government, particularly of Kenya. The fact that such veiled criticisms were printed and disseminated from the capital city of Kenya and in the same newsletters that UNICEF and other donors funded, as acknowledgements in most of the issues reminded the reader, speaks to the tightrope that Femnet's members walked in their public-facing advocacy. And it's also in this context that we can begin to interpret Femnet's ostensible silence in response to the editing of the Girl Child Project. Multiple forms of silences and silencing, strategic forms of communication, and ambivalent dependencies characterize this lobbying campaign and the global history in which it's embedded. So not all aspects of the circulation of knowledge about girls were so blatantly suppressive as this case study. FemNet's work with UNICEF surrounding the lobbying campaign that created and internationalized Girls in Development included a range of interactions. The one I've just described is on an extreme end of that range. These interactions were characterized by a mix of agreements, frictions, and outright ruptures in a world in which FemNet relied on UNICEF for survival. UNICEF was one of FemNet's top donors during the late 1980s and early 1990s, and FemNet's first secretariat was actually in UNICEF's physical offices in Nairobi. And in turn, UNICEF relied on the US government. The US was UNICEF's top donor during the same time period. So the point here is that the history of girls in development is a story of the intentional non-circulation of particular forms of knowledge that did not become dominant, that at times were not even publicly utterable alongside the circulation of ideas that did. Let's regroup and return to our starting point. How did girls in development emerge, circulate, and become common sense among a broad range of actors? I argue that it did so in part through a lobbying campaign that was carried out by members of UNICEF and FemNet leading up to the final UN World Conference on Women in 1995. But the history of the lobbying campaign is not merely a story of the global spread of ideas or knowledge. It's also a global history of erasure. The Girl Child Project provides one case study in the lobbying campaign to show how knowledge suppression and amplification emerged hand in hand as particular logics concerning girls in development became hegemonic. It offers key examples of how conflicting forms of knowledge about girls, including anti-colonial, socialist, and anti-capitalist knowledge, were selectively suppressed, silenced, and whittled down into a singular narrative that we might call neoliberal. What does this tell us about how we approach and write global and international histories? In this talk, I've questioned a particular methodological trend that's common across history as a discipline, of starting with one point, in this case, the existence of girls in development as a hegemonic and neoliberal set of norms in the early 2000s, and tracing its links with what came before, according to notions of Eurocentric diffusion or North Atlantic diffusion and continuity. One problem with this model is that it presents a history that's both incomplete and that has systematically written African women as individuals, the institutions they built, such as FemNet, and their epistemologies, ideas, and politics out of history. And as a result of using these methodologies, people have then inadvertently reproduced the silences and erasures that were so central to the creation and internationalization of girls in development in the first place. There's always so much more to say, but I'll stop here and sincerely thank you for listening. And if you want to hear more, this talk is based on an article I wrote that's forthcoming in the American Historical Review. I don't have an issue date yet, but it's in copy edits. And that in turn is based on a book that I'm finishing now. And I'm really excited to hear your comments and questions. And thank you all again.
Thank you, Sarah. Really, really interesting. Now I'll give the microphone to Martín. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. First of all, I would like to start by thanking the members of the International History Seminar, el Seminario de Historia Internacional, for the invitation, which I was very, very pleased to accept. Thank you to the different colleagues at various institutions here in Mexico, as well as in Italy, Germany, everywhere, for making this session possible and for promoting this exchange between scholars, scholars not only from different traditions in history, but also at various moments of their careers and at different parts of the world right now. I am truly very happy to be here, if not physically, through this conference call to discuss and comment Dr. Bellows-Blakely's fascinating work. And before I dive in on my comment, I would like to give a shout out to Ana Sofia Rodriguez Everard, who has been very kind and very helpful, staying in contact with all of us as this session was organized. Thank you, Ana Sofia. Thank you, Dr. Bellows-Blakely, for your presentation, and thank you for sharing with us this article still unpublished. I think it is a very original piece that combines rigorous historical research, historical imagination, and a very precise methodological proposal that is very much, as you have just said, at the center of your argument, at the center of it all. The paper's approach can also hardly be described as a strict exercise of a single historiographical trend or historical tradition. As most good pieces of writing within the field, for me at least, it combines different approaches. It is an international history of NGOs, an international history of feminist collectives, and of development programs. It is an intellectual history or a history of knowledge creation and circulation, as you have said. And as we have seen, it stresses the silencings and the erasures in those processes. Since it deals with ideas of development and human rights, it is also a political history in that regard. And through its attention to ideas surrounding girls that are very appropriately described as the locus of anxieties in the context of global economic crisis that began in the late 70s, it also informs different histories of gender and histories of childhood. These just to name a few of the forms that come to my mind when trying to describe this research and the way it is framed. I believe that it is precisely in this profusion that makes this work all the more valuable. I hope we can all very soon be able to share the finished published version of your paper with our peers, colleagues, and students. I also look forward to the broader research, the book project you're currently working in, Sarah. I believe today's session was actually named after that book project, so we're also looking forward to that. And well, as you have all heard from Dr. Bellows-Blakely herself, her research delves into the emergence of the girls in development approach as a solution to growing poverty rates and lowering living standards in the global South. The idea that investing in girls' education should be a key element to interventions by international organizations, development agencies, and even governments became sort of standard by the late 90s. And as we have seen, especially after the 1995 World Economic Conference on Women in Beijing. And what Bellows-Blakely argues is that this perspective was not, as common sense and even some literature might suggest, imposed by the IMF and USAID as they promoted structural adjustment programs and, well, basically neoliberalism around the globe. This work stresses that earlier colonial and developmentalist approaches towards aid to Africa and to the global South in general were already profoundly gendered. And they were centered in a discourse that supposedly, that was supposed to protect women from their quote unquote backwards traditional society. And more specifically, Bellows-Blakely traces exchanges, efforts, disagreements, and discussions between UNICEF and Pan-African feminist NGO Femnet based in Nairobi that were instrumental into the global spread of the girls in development approach. And by doing so, this study not only makes a case for a different explanation of how girls in development became such a dominant approach in development programs and public policy, it also puts forward what I think is a very interesting methodological proposal to writing history, which denies traditional teleological approaches centered in tracing the versions of the winning side of a public discussion. At the same time, it resists the temptation to follow the trend that focuses on the agency of those whose ideas were silent. Bellows-Blakely prefers to frame her research by presenting us with a more complex picture of this historical process and emphasizes its contentious dynamic. She also points out how contested ideas of the effects of economic crisis on girls were erased and silenced. We are therefore faced, or at least that's what I think, with a history that actually recognizes agency and resistance implicitly, but does not ignore the exercise of power. It is this exercise of power what in fact makes us think of some of these efforts as acts of resistance in the first place. I find this perspective particularly interesting because I think it helps us think about the prerogative of explanation in history. I think oftentimes historians were expected to offer certain explanations about how things came to be the way they are, right? And I don't necessarily think that we are making justice to our tasks as historians by complying to those expectations. Do we as historians explain how events unfolded to offer a sort of guide to our present? Or do we study the past in all its complexity and uncertainty and try to describe processes that were messy and don't necessarily make sense to us from our present point of view? These are questions that I have posed to myself and that I would like to pose to Sarah. I am particularly interested in hearing more about how you came to this sort of solution to the agency versus structure debate as you were working on your project, or if these were ideas that had been helpful to you in previous research projects, for example. I also wanted to point out the way you work with the archive in your study and how you came to recognize some of the silencings and erasures that you explained throughout the article. I think it is very instructive for history students, for example, the way you used your historical imagination and identified excerpts written out from the Girl Child Project, this report prepared for UNICEF by Femnet staff, by comparing versions of our report as opposed to looking for an explicit order of censorship. In that sense, I wanted to ask if you could share with us maybe other interesting findings in the archive, maybe from your research project at large that help you document these erasures. In the article you shared, for example, you shared about this practice of bracketing excerpts or concepts out of UN documents as a common practice. And I find that those two examples to be very interesting ways of listening to the archives by what it doesn't say rather than what it says. I think that the way that you indirectly documented a sort of censorship is a bright use of the archive, and it spoke to me particularly because that is something that I have experienced firsthand as an LGBTQ scholar in Mexico. Oftentimes, international NGOs do use their budget to hire specialists in the regions they work at. But the talent and workforce of those specialists is expected to comply to a particular framework imposed by the donors. And much as Femnet staff, I will remain silent about the details, obviously. Your work very much exposes this somewhat perverse, or maybe that is too severe, but it exposes this practice, including the importance of donors in the process of creating supposedly objective knowledge about a population or a social issue. And as I was reading you, I kept thinking about a keynote speech I had the opportunity to attend to last spring at Duke University's Feminist Theory workshop by Professor Durba Mitter, a historian of modern South Asia. I think this keynote speech is in YouTube. I can share it with you if you like. I will post it in the chat for the rest of the group. She is currently working on a project about the status of women report. The status of women report as a genre that emerged in the 70s in this same context of UN international feminism. And in her keynote, she insists in how the prerogative to write these annual reports promoted a sort of political economy in which third world feminist scholars and thinkers invested an important amount of time and effort that maybe led nowhere in terms of policy and that might have been best invested elsewhere. I'm obviously simplifying her ideas, but I wanted to share this and see if it spoke to you about your research. I guess I'm trying to ask to you if do you see some of that frustration reflected in the archives circulating around African feminist activists of the Rift Valley, or if has this idea of misdirected or manipulation of feminist talent and workforce crossed your mind in some way during your research, right? And also, now that I'm mentioning work of other scholars, I also wanted to suggest that you maybe take a look to the work of R.W. Connell, Rowan Connell, a trans sociologist from Australia. He has made some of the first contributions to the history of masculinity and has been recently doing research regarding neoliberalism in the global South. I was thinking that maybe you might benefit from a dialogue with her work. It is not only a great example of how the study of gender and the study of neoliberalism collide, at least biographically in this case, but also, much as in your work, he has been insisting in the fact that thinking of neoliberalism as an imposition from the North ignores some of its origins in the global South, right? And now that I think about it, well, I prepared this actually, but thinking about it, I thought that unveiling the way in which colonial thinking has imposed some false sort of common sense theories about the origins of important components of world order is indeed a task that some other historians have also been taking recently. I am thinking of the work, for example, of Catherine Marino from UCLA, whose book traces the importance of early 20th century Latin American international feminists in the creation of the UN and the international human rights system. And I think that maybe we are upon a new, very necessary historiographical trend in international history, right? And I wanted to ask you, how do you see yourself as a historian in that regard, maybe positioned around this literature? These are, well, some of the comments I wanted to share with you and with the rest of the audience. And before I finish, I just wanted to ask you two last quick questions. The first one is about the UNICEF archive. You mentioned in your article that the archive, like the official UNICEF archives, have been closed for a while, ever since 2012, I think, and that you have only had access to some of its digitized material, right? And I was wondering if that situation has changed, recently, or what do you think you would have found? I think maybe it's not a great question, but it's sort of for us to use our imagination. What do you think you would have found, and how would your research changed if you had access to that material? Because maybe sometimes when we are exposed to dominant repertoires and archives, we tend to disregard maybe more important things as you have noticed, as the ones you have noticed at the Femnet archive, right? And the second question has to do with gender essentialism in the Girls in Development framework as it was being discussed or maybe laid out. You very eloquently explained the strategic and a bit perverse way in which UNICEF argued that girls were at risk in the context of crisis in the global south, supposedly because of quote unquote traditional values of their communities and families that neglected their education. And at the same time that they drew upon those very traditional roles of women as the ones in charge of social reproduction to impose on them the responsibility of economic development, right? However, I suspect that is not all in the story. I suspect that gender essentialist ideas of maybe the quote unquote natural goodness of women might also come into play in the discussion. And I wanted to ask to you if you've seen that. Because this might also lead us to think about conceptions of masculinity as men in the global south are thought of as maybe reckless or irresponsible, and therefore not as good an investment for development. What do you make of that? I think I would leave you with those questions. I hope you find them useful and interesting. And once again, thank you for your paper. Thank you very much, and congratulations for your work.
Thank you so much for this wonderful set of feedback, Dr. González. It's such a generous interpretation of my work, and I'm really grateful for it. A lot of this I'm going to keep thinking about and kind of letting gestate as I keep working on the book. Maybe I'll do my best to concisely answer some of your questions now, knowing that we could talk about this for hours, and I'll also try to leave plenty of space for the audience to ask questions as well. So I hope I wrote all of these down right. Your first question was about why we study the past, and is it in order to explain our present moment, or is it in order to grapple with complexity, things we don't understand, things that confuse us? I think the purest historian would answer that it's the latter, but in reality, so much of historical scholarship is still driven by the former. And for me, it's a combination of the two. So there are clear political stakes in this project that motivated my interest in it from the beginning. It was starting when I was an undergraduate student, seeing all of these narratives. If we just invest in girls, we'll fix these problems from below, in ways that seemed to me as an uninformed spectator at the time as a fantasy. But I also wanted to know more about how this came about as someone who's very committed personally to ideas of gender-based rights, among other things. Sarah Ahmed has this quotation, and I'm sure I'll not get it correct, but she calls on us as scholars to, and Antoinette Burton has built on this, to sit with histories that estrange us from the past as much as they connect us to it. And it was allowing myself to embrace that part of the process that I think broke open this history in new ways, instead of just telling another story of look at how neoliberal capitalism arose in kind of predictable ways. I'm not sure if that fully answers the question, but I think I have no problem with presentist concerns motivating how people get into history, as long as that doesn't lead you to overlook the confusing, complicated uncomfortable things. And I think this also means we need to question why we're writing history on an emotional level. A lot of the graduate students who I work with still seem kind of subconsciously, they're very drawn to these narratives that make them celebrate. They're looking for heroes in history, not only graduate students, my peers as well, and mentors. People want to find these resistance narratives to kind of cheer along and think, oh, if only history had gone this way, maybe things would be different now, or I can look for inspiration for my life in the present in history. And I think I won't bash all of these, but I don't think that can be the only reason for writing history. And in African history in particular, there's this tendency to always kind of fall back on agency as the concluding argument. Lynn Thomas talks about this in a really brilliant article that she wrote a few years ago. And so I didn't want to get into this kind of romantic, celebrate, write this feel-good history because it makes me feel better. I also didn't want to just get into another story of kind of brute power. I wanted to break it open and look at the very human complexity inside. And so that's what I set out to do. And I think I'll stop there. How did I work with the archive in my study? And you asked about other interesting archival findings that helped me document these erasures. I'll couple this also with your second to last question about the UNICEF archive being closed. So in the version of the article that you read, but I didn't have time to talk about it today. So the UNICEF archive has been closed for outside researchers since at least 2012 when I started trying to access it. Much to my shock, I got a grant to actually go there and showed up because it said on the website that it was open. And I emailed somebody to set up an appointment and they said, oh, we're closed indefinitely for restructuring. And that was 11 years ago, and they're still closed. The last that I've seen on the website and the last email communications I had, which now it's been a while, it's just indefinitely closed for restructuring. I won't speculate as to why that's the case. As somebody who was trained in African history, I always knew that I would spend a good chunk of time researching for this project in Nairobi. But the closure of the UNICEF archive then really forced me to get even more creative in trying to find other sources to piece it together. I think in terms of how the narrative would have changed if I'd had access to the UNICEF archive, because what we have now is they're publicly available documents. They would submit reports to the UN that were archived in the broader UN system because UNICEF has a separate archive. So some unpublished things from UNICEF are available in the broader UN archive. Their internal histories, I kind of pieced it together, but it made me get creative in the other archives that I was looking at. And so I spent about 2 years researching for this. 1.5 years of it was in Nairobi, full time. And I just started knocking on doors at NGOs to ask if they had an archive. A lot of the histories that I've read don't really deal with NGO archives. They're still situated in colonial or nation state archives. So it was figuring out, do these archives exist? Where are they? Are they accessible? Most NGOs that I was talking to didn't have archives. There's kind of high institutional turnover, lack of institutional memory, but a few of them did. And it was that process that led me to FemNet. And they have this reading room. They got money from UNESCO to create their own archive. They have a full-time librarian who works in it. And so I was just kind of going through everything I could find there, including then that's how I got certain information on UNICEF that was from that NGO archive and other NGO archives of people who had worked with them. But I found this report on the situational analysis of girls' education, the Girl Child Project, and it was the unpublished version. And I started reading it and I went, gosh, I need to find the published version because I don't want to cite the draft. I should cite what actually went out, but I couldn't find the published version from Nairobi. Speaking of unequal access to sources, I needed to go back to an institution in the US in order to request it through interlibrary loan. So in the meantime, I started reading this unpublished version, and then I got the published version and started reading it so that I knew which page numbers to cite. And I was like, wait, this is very different. And so it was something that I stumbled into accidentally. And so then I went kind of paragraph by paragraph to compare them. And then I also did some interviews. I tried to ask about this, but probably predictably, people didn't want to publicly say bad things about UNICEF. Some people said some things off the record. People were very nervous about it. But then it was time in the archive and time sitting with things that surprised me, confused me, that kind of led me to trip over this history. And it was a similar process. You mentioned kind of other examples of where I found erasures. So the other example that I give in the article that you read was after this report is published in 92, as the lobbying campaign actually gets going in earnest. They didn't call themselves a lobbying campaign until 93, 94, leading into Beijing. There are all these negotiations over the draft text of the platform for action that'll be adopted at the conference. And so at this planning meeting in New York City that the Commission on the Status of Women hosted in March of 1995, that's where the lobbying campaign successfully gets girls written into the document. But they also want other things written into the document, particularly the kind of Femnet and Pan-African lobbyists also want condemnations of structural adjustment written into the document and calls for high-level economic change. And the delegates to the meeting from the US said, we're not voting for a document that has that in it. And there are these technologies that in the UN system, you can put a text in brackets in a conference document. And if you bracket it, it means it's an indication I'm not voting for this. Like my state delegate won't vote for this unless this language is either removed or changed. And so the US delegation bracketed a lot of the information in the draft Beijing platform for action, calling for this kind of high-level structural economic change. And so it's another technology of then how it gets erased. And the US government then kind of made deals saying, well, we'll give money to this state or we'll help fund the implementation of the platform for action in these countries if you agree to take this language out. So I'm not sure I'm answering this question very concisely, but in terms of how I found, like your first question of how I found these types of silencing and erasures, a lot of it was just time in archives. And then you don't find a perfect trail of it. Like when I found these two documents where the draft looked different than the published version, you know, I never found the smoking gun of my name is so-and-so and I'm the one who redacted this because of XYZ. Maybe that's in the UNICEF archive. I kind of doubt it. I think if it had been there, it would have been in the archives of UNICEF's Nairobi-based offices, but they had a big corruption scandal in the 1990s. It took me a long time to get a meeting there. They said that they'd turned over their records to the government of Kenya. So I think those records are gone. So there aren't perfect paper trails of this. And so then I was kind of left to look in other places. So the newsletters that Femnet created around the same time, what are they saying about this? And you kind of have to creatively look. But then for me, the big answer was just put this all in context and think, okay, what's going on in Femnet at the time? Often it's very simple, follow the money, but it's not only follow the money. I need to get more efficient at answering your questions. I think I won't do all of them. Durba Mitra is a brilliant scholar whose work I absolutely love and follow. And you asked my thoughts about her argument that writing annual reports for the UN often was a way to kind of marshal the intellectual labor of women in the global South that then led to nothing or non-policy action. It's a fascinating argument. I think I've tried to shy away from, I certainly have my own normative frameworks that I impose on this. I think anybody listening to this can guess that I'm not the biggest fan of neoliberal feminism. With that said, I would like to shy away from evaluating whether it was useful or useless, and instead look at what function did participating in this type of knowledge creation serve for Femnet's members. And they weren't, I mean, some of them were very powerful women in other capacities. One of the founders and the first chairperson, Dr. Edith Gachukia, was a member of parliament in Kenya. She had various roles at the previous UN conferences for women. She was one of the heads of the biggest women's organization in Kenya, Maendeleo ya Wanawake. Now she runs, she's in her 80s, she runs a set of private schools with her husband. I mean, like she's been politically active in a number of places. So I wouldn't, NGO work for some women like Achukia, even as they were very powerful and politically active in other spaces, sometimes in the archive you do find national politics is not an avenue that's as open to me as my male peers for various reasons. And so the NGO world then becomes an avenue where very highly educated and politically connected women, certainly in East Africa, go. And then just as being involved in national politics has its constraints about what you can and can't do, the NGO world has a whole other set of constraints around it. Yeah. Looking here, I think the last one, how do I see myself as a historian of international order? That's such a wonderful question, and I think it's going to suck up too much time to answer beyond giving kudos to the works you mentioned and the works of people like Glenda Sluga. I think there's a rethinking of what kinds of actors have been involved in the international order, what kinds of institutions. I'll just leave it there. I'll leave it there and say, let's talk about this over coffee sometime. And the last question about gender and girls in development and how gendered ideas of the natural goodness of women may have also come into play and what this says about conceptions of masculinity. You hit the nail on the head. In UNICEF's public-facing advocacy in the 80s, and in some of the internal documents I've been able to find, as they're turning to girls in the context of economic crisis, ongoing recession, the growth of structural adjustment, there's this increasingly pervasive view that, and I'm certainly not the first person to make this argument, that women represent a better investment for development because they're not lazy, they're not alcoholic, they're not abusive. It's promoting this idea that men, and it's very racially coded, often brown and black men in the global South are inherently violent, irresponsible, patriarchal, oppressive. And one of the things I'm trying to pick apart in the book is how this narrative that locates the roots of patriarchy almost as kind of a free existing thing, separate from context, separate from history. It just magically exists in certain parts of the world and in certain cultures and in the nuclear family, how that idea arises as people saying, well, patriarchy in the family, of course, is connected to economic labor structures, to conditions under colonialism and neocolonialism, and these two things can't be separated. And so the depictions of masculinity and femininity and who is or isn't a better site for development investment is part and parcel for me of this history of decoupling patriarchy and different forms of violence within the family from their structural causes and contexts. I'm going to put a point on it. Thank you again. I have so much to think about. I'm grateful, and I would love to hear questions from the audience as well.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Martin, for such an interesting and comprehensive commentary on Sarah's work, both in terms of content and relevance, but also in terms of methodology and historiography. And so it was really interesting. So I'd like to open the floor for questions first amongst the members of the seminar. I have plenty, but I really like to hear some of my colleagues. So if you can maybe raise your hands, or yeah, Gerardo, go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Hello, Sarah. Thank you for that very interesting presentation. It was very good. I had one comment and one question. So the comment is, first of all, I would like to congratulate you, because I think this is a great example of archival research. It's really in-depth and thorough. Like we often claim that governments and donors have pressure over the reports of multilateral institutions, right? But that's such a general assessment that we just take it for granted, right? But here you actually prove it very specifically in one very, very well researched case. So I would just like to commend you on that one. It's very interesting. On a little side comment on that is usually these reports are the result over power struggles, not only within local NGOs and national or governmental agencies, international bodies, right? But also within the local administrations, within governments, right? So there's usually blame following around between this state government and that state government and that state office. So I would just like to say that I really love that part of your article, right, on erasure, construction of knowledge. The question in general has to do with, while I was reading this, it really reminded me of Mexico's overpopulation control efforts in the 1970s, right? It's I feel it's the same language. It's kind of the same ideas overall, right? But the objective back then was obviously to try to control overpopulation, this and that, like this general story that we know. So I just wanted to ask you, like, if you can trace the origins of the girl-child projects in Africa in the 1980s to that general trend in the 1970s that started in the late 60s to try to combat this sort of fake idea of the population bomb, right, that was growing back then. And that was it. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Gerardo. Yes, absolutely. Population control efforts, not only in Mexico City, but elsewhere, since much earlier in the 20th century, is one of the crucial kind of taproots of this history. I think one key difference from these policies is that in the 80s, there's a new language about needing to focus on girls as opposed to, or in addition to, women, whereas before, most of the population control efforts in rhetoric, and also often in practice, because people wanted to pretend like schoolgirls were abstinent, were focused on women. Michelle Murphy has a really brilliant book called The Economization of Life that looks at population control efforts and how this connects to the growth of girls in development planning. So I won't repeat all of it now. I'll direct you to her book. I'll put it in the chat. It's The Economization of Life by Michelle Murphy. There are also earlier antecedents to this in various forms of colonial development and welfare programming, health and hygiene programming, going back to like the 1930s in various colonial and post-colonial contexts. And most histories of Africa focus on the colonial period. And so one of the first questions I get when I present this work in African history seminars is, why aren't you talking about the colonial period? And there absolutely are essential connections going back earlier in the 20th century and before. What I do think is unique about this 1980s moment is that these earlier forms of developmentalism focused on women, women's sexuality, women's bodies, gets narrowed into the girl child in very new and specific ways in the context of a perceived crisis in capitalism with ongoing recession and structural adjustment. So that's what I would argue is new, but absolutely continuity. And check out Michelle Murphy's book. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Andrea?
Yes, thank you, Ana Sofia. Sarah, it was so exciting to hear you, to listen to you, and to read the text. So thank you very much. I want to give you also a comment and then just a question. I really like that the approach was from the historical discipline, since many of these works that come from other social science usually have complications in the contextualization of social problems. So I found it very, very critical, and that was exciting. In particular, I like how you approach the international bureaucracy as a political and economic actor that exerts a narrative power over human rights movements, which should be universal, but are westernized, no? So it reminds me of what Daniel Feierstein says about genocide, when he comments that an international organization, even like the UN, has a clear tendency to homogenize historical processes based on categories created according to European experiences, which lead us then to have to criticize this type of initiatives on the basis of, I think, 3 points. First, the commercialization of human rights. I found that very, very interesting. Second, the human rights, in this case, women and girls' rights, as a pretext for modern expansionism, which may even hide extractivist objectives, I think. And that's my comment. And lastly, for human rights researchers to allow themselves to be overshadowed by the narrative force of these institutions and to lose the critique of these proposals because they seem noble, but in the end tend to ignore the real conflicts and own logics. So my question is, so I work, my research is about political history, so maybe it's because of that. My question goes to how to approach and think about such huge institutions like the UN, the UNESCO, and human rights projects, etc., as political and ideological actors. So because it may be overwhelming, but you manage to characterize them in a very precise way in your work. So how did you approach and think about these institutions as political and ideological actors? That's my question. Thank you, Sarah.
Andrea, thank you for this great question. This one I also need to think about. When I went into this project, I'd done graduate coursework on the history of the UN. Of course, I knew that from the beginning, the UN was created in a particular post-World War II context that was deeply influenced by the US. Not only the US, though, sometimes it's kind of US centrism dominates. There's been great scholarship on how, obviously, Eastern Bloc, Russia has been a driving political force behind the UN. Kristen Goetze has some really provocative scholarship on this, looking at Eastern Bloc women's rights mobilization and how that kind of underpinned the first few UN World Conferences on women. There's been work on the Scandinavian countries as crucial forces in the UN. So I think coming into this, I knew as a historian, of course, the UN was deeply beholden to Cold War politics and served as a battlefield where these fights and also politics of decolonization are constantly being waged, like the new international economic order. There's so many different kind of constantly changing factions of people trying to figure out how they could use the space to make certain political claims. So I think viewing something as enormous as the UN with these kind of semi-autonomous agencies like UNICEF or UNESCO, it's realizing there are a lot of different, there's not one hegemonic kind of political agenda within it at a given time. And if there is, like if girls in development becomes seemingly hegemonic at a certain point in time, that's something that has to be explained and problematized rather than treated as natural. Glenda Sluga has some really interesting work on like the behind the scenes infighting politics negotiations that went on at UNESCO. And it makes me really sad that I couldn't get into the UNICEF archive because I'm sure I would have found this. I think UNICEF would have probably come across actually much more sympathetically if I'd have been able to see what's going on behind that curtain and all of the difficult choices and infighting and things that are happening there. So I think, I don't know, I think I would turn the question that you asked on its head, which is nobody should treat the UN or these international institutions as apolitical spaces, but they're also spaces where politics are working much more in very complicated ways. And so finding sources, getting into archives, whatever your source base is, it's adding nuance to the story instead of falling back on these kind of convenient narratives of there's a bipolar Cold War world. And yeah, I don't know if that fully answered your question. I'm gonna keep thinking about it, and thanks very much, Andrea. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, it was great. Thank you.
Thank you. I actually have a question from the audience, but it was sent directly to me because she couldn't write the question on the YouTube thingy. And she asks if you have any evidence of contacts between these African NGOs and other global South networks of women that before Beijing, and if these or if these were always mediated by UNICEF and multilateral bodies. And I see, if you can answer that, and then I'll pose my question.
Yes, great, thank you. Yes, and this is part of it, the story that also really excites me. Etta Gachukia talks about going to, so she was in Mexico City at the first UN World Conference on Women. She was in Copenhagen, and she says and she was there at that time representing the Kenyan state as a member of parliament. And she says, at that time, I wasn't so interested in issues of women. I considered myself more an anti-racist and kind of decolonial, anti-colonial advocate. And it was through communicating with other women. She talks about delegates from South Asia, but other women from what we might call the global South, that she says she became awakened to the plight of women. And so then in the process of setting up FemNet in 1988, there was a precursor organization to it that was founded just before the third UN World Conference on Women in Nairobi. But a lot of these women as individuals, but then FemNet as an institution had multiple forms of exchange with other NGOs. In the FemNet newsletters, I actually really want to, in the book, reprint some of the cartoons that they have, because they have these amazing cartoons. Like one of them, it's a figure of a Black man on his knees begging Uncle Sam, the US patriotic figure. And Uncle Sam has a big belly, and he is carrying a box that says resources stolen from Africa. And the man on his knees is begging for a small pittance of these resources that have been stolen to be given back to him. But these cartoons that FemNet News produced often were reproductions from newsletters from other NGOs or other organizations and other places. And so then finding the copyright, I can't reproduce it in the book. This is just an aside to say, yes, there were a lot of contacts, and in the newsletters, those contacts become clear. Maybe they'll cite a new report that came out of the Philippines on breastfeeding versus bottle feeding. And some of these contacts were mediated through UNICEF, but a lot of them weren't. So a lot of FemNet's members had connections and contacts of their own. There's so much fruitful terrain for people to explore this and other research projects. Yeah.
Thank you. And I think I'll take advantage to ask you my questions. First, I wanted to ask you if among the more critical activists of these African NGOs that you study, was there a position that advocated for including boys in these conversations on development? Because I asked this because since the first UN Women's Conference in 1975 held in Mexico City, actually, and which has been very well studied by Jocelyn Olcott in a recent book, one of the big confrontations between North and South women participating in the NGO Tribune had to do with the fact that for women in the third world countries, any real emancipation, which for them was first and foremost economic and more linked to discussions on dependency and so, necessarily included men. At the same time, I feel in feminism, raising sort of deconstructed boys has also been a worry, like a long-term worry, no? So in that sense, I feel like they're not at odds, these two positions, if we think about boys, right? And they're not at odds with these more individualistic solutions that you show us. So I was wondering, if in that sense, policies directed to boys could be something that maybe unified both sides of the debate, if you encountered any of these things in your research. A second thing I wanted to ask you is regarding the punitive approaches to fight gender violence, which also come from this time of international relations, multilateralism, and so. They're also said to have arisen from the abandonment of strategies that attempted to fight gender inequality structurally for more sort of individualized solutions, right? Like targeting and deterring individuals of committing this violence through the carceral system and so. And I don't know, I mean, maybe this is a stretch, but I'm curious whether this is something that could maybe be related to girls entering the stage of women's rights, since they're sort of more vulnerable. So if there's maybe a link between vulnerability and punitivism that comes from these discussions having girls at the center. And then a methodological question. I know that in your book, you do work with oral sources, but I wonder why didn't you use them in this article, especially for the part on yeah, who authored the Girl Child Project report. I'm assuming someone must know. It was probably like a conscious decision that you took to maybe not ask. So yeah, those are 3 questions that I'd like to ask you.
Ana Sofia, thank you so much for these great questions. And as I've said a few times, I'll have to keep thinking about some of these. Was there a position that wanted to include boys? Yes. Increasingly, kind of where I stopped this story today in 1995, there's increasing conversation about, oh, we can't neglect the boy child as we focus on the girl child. Occasionally in some of FemNet's earlier advocacy, these stances would pop up, but generally not. Generally, it was, yes, we need to be able to work with men. We need boys and men to be our partners. We need to sensitize them, but it wasn't portraying the boy child as vulnerable or a victim in the same way that the girl child was, generally. And then in the mid-90s, languages of vulnerability around boy childhood also start to become more prominent. And then some of these arguments get used to then critique and oppose girl-focused developmentalism on the grounds that, oh, it's too focused on girls, it's leaving boys behind. In terms of how this played out at the UN World Conference, and thinking about Jocelyn Alcott's great book about these kind of geopolitical divides at the conferences themselves, that's a good question. I don't know. I don't have sources. So the sources I have are that the girl child was one of the most popular topics in Beijing that a lot of people rallied behind, especially once the kind of socialist or anti-structural adjustment, pro-welfare state politics were stripped out of it. It's portrayed as kind of a unifying theme that helped paper over some of these cleavages that had really dominated previous UN World Conferences on women. So where in Nairobi, Edgar Chukia talks about being shouted at for being an African woman who didn't forcefully enough denounce female circumcision or female genital mutilation. There are different terms people use. In Beijing, the narrative coming out of it is much more, oh, through the vehicle of girl-focused developmentalism being written into the platform, now we have much more kind of harmony, and we could pick apart these narratives, but that's how, in the sources I have, that's how it plays out in Beijing. I don't have a great answer to your second question about if the rise of girl-focused programming was connected to punitive approaches to fight gender violence. That's really fascinating. And the kind of proposition you put forth about languages of vulnerability around girlhood leading to more punitive approaches, I could absolutely see. I mean, there's huge, very contentious debates about, pedophilia and the ways that age of consent laws get mobilized also in particularly punitive, often racialized ways. So I think there's a great global history to write here if you want to write it. And why didn't I use oral histories? That's a great question in this, because I did conduct them. So some of it for the article was just a length issue. I only had so many words. And once you get into oral histories, then everybody wants to hear so much more about the methodologies than if you just say I'm working with written sources, which, I mean, yes, oral histories are imperfect, but so are written sources. So I'm always a little bit troubled by this kind of defend your methodology if they're oral sources, but just don't say anything about it if they're written sources. So some of it was a strategic decision, and some of it was also a reflection of the kinds of oral histories that I ended up conducting and the kinds of information I got out of them. So when talking about UNICEF, no one was willing to go on the record and have their name or any identifying information publicly shared. People were afraid for their jobs. And I'm not even implicating FemNet here. Like I did interviews at multiple different NGOs. Other times, really senior people, like at FemNet, because FemNet was a Pan-African umbrella NGO that coordinated for NGOs all over the continent. So a lot of its members were other NGOs. And so they're kind of a senior NGO. And a lot of those women, like Edgar Chukia, who I've mentioned, was a member of parliament. I tried to get access to interview her, and she's just way too important and famous and busy to talk to me, which totally fair. So the kinds of information that I had from the oral histories, it gave me anecdotes that I couldn't quote and attribute a name to. I actually didn't get a name of who doctored the reports. I still don't know. Some of the people I contacted who are most connected to this history just never got back to me, which also fair. I don't want to put anybody in a dangerous position, and I certainly don't have the right to access whoever I want to talk to. But it also, one of the main values of the oral histories was that it led me to the FemNet archive, and there were some other NGO archives I had access to. It was talking to people who then kind of through that I could map out this world of NGO connections and figure out who the main players were, and then go look for other types of sources that corroborated a lot of what they were telling me that they didn't want to go on record as saying. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think Daniel has one question, and with that, I think we should be closing.
Thank you, Ana Sofia. And I don't have a question. I just want to say something that I found really interesting, like a comment that I hope I can engage with Sarah and her work from that. First of all, thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you very much, Martin. It's been fascinating. I've learned a lot, and I don't want to take too long, but I found it fascinating how you present us, and it's in your paper, and then you talked about it when you were presenting, Sarah. And it's a very presentist comment, but I'm going to say a very presentist concern. You present us with the need to problematize our views and narratives of non-governmental politics, right? Of NGOs, which we're very used to seeing as purely neoliberal, a creature of the neoliberal age, you know? And it was fascinating for me to listen about this Marxist and non-neoliberal and other kinds of frameworks for non-governmental work. And I think it's very necessary. We're very used to reading these trajectories, especially through ethnographic and anthropological work, but there's very little history, as far as I know, of the importance of non-governmental work in the third world, for example. They play a crucial role, and they've been playing it for decades now. And I don't know if I don't have a question. I found this fascinating, and I think it's very interesting to think about. And I don't know if you're trying to, or if you're interested in that, or if in any case it's useful for you to think of. But I think what you're doing contributes to this very necessary work, which we have to undertake, I think, especially in countries like Mexico and elsewhere, and try to combat this divide between government, social, civil society. In Mexico, this is a big issue now, no? But I think everywhere in the third world it is, and I just found it fascinating. And thank you for your work and presentation, and thank you, Martin and Ana Sofia, for the moderation work. Thank you.
And Sarah, before you answer, Itzel has now the final question.
Thank you, Sarah, for your presentation, and Martin for your comments. It has been great to hear you. I also have many ideas and comments, but my specific question is, what comes next from your research about your book, and if you're going to work on other parts? Yes, just to congratulate you, because I'm interested in history of international organizations and history of women in international relations, and most of the literature that covers the 90s, 2000s, 2010s, it's from political science and international relations. And I'm always lacking this historical perspective. So thanks a lot for doing it. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for these really lovely comments. And also thank all of you. I'm really so delighted to be here. Daniel, your comment about needing to problematize our views on NGOs, it's so fascinating. It depends on who I present to. So of course, scholars of Latin America often have the view that NGOs are just neoliberal pawns, because that's the literature that has shown us that this has often been the case. A lot of the literature on NGOization and this accompanying shrinking welfare states came out of Latin American studies and various connected fields. In other fields, there's still this kind of romanticization of NGOs as civil society actors, as a very kind of normative, there's, promoting human rights frameworks. And so I think in any case, as a historian, our job is to peel back the curtains and look at the complexity, which doesn't erase these higher level processes. I mean, you can't tell a history of NGOs without talking about neoliberal capitalism. But as you point out, in this history, there are a lot of other economic politics at work. It's a space where women, Pan-African Black women, can come together and talk to each other and talk about various ideas, generate knowledge, but there are constraints on that, and they reflect on those constraints sometimes in the newsletters. But so, yeah, without kind of giving up these meta-narratives that we still need, I'm absolutely an advocate for precision and complexity, which means we have to be willing to be surprised or to find things that kind of go against the inherited orthodoxies we receive. It's still in terms of what comes next. Thanks so much for your congratulations. I just have to finish this dang book. And it's getting the book out. And then from here, other projects that spawn from this, absolutely. I work in German academia now, where there's often an expectation that as a historian, your next project will cover a different region, different century, different methodological approach. And I have some of my own difficult structural choices to make between positioning myself for the labor market and doing what I really want to do. And so the way that I've pitched it now is working on a next project that kind of stems from this, but that's a longer term history of intersectional frameworks that both talk to and decenter North America-based actors. So a global history of intersectionality from a wider cast of thinkers than who we think of now when we think of intersectionality. And yeah, we'll see. But this is the book out. And hopefully the article will sail through the copy edits and come out in the not too distant future. Thank you all again. I'm really grateful. You've given me so much to think about, and these types of international knowledge exchanges I think are so important, and it's really my privilege to be here. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, and thank you everyone. Gracias a todos en la audiencia, a los miembros del seminario, a quienes se conectaron también a la sesión. Muchísimas gracias por todo. Thank you, Sarah, and hopefully we'll see you soon again.
Gracias.
Thanks.
And thank you, Martín, especially also.
Sí.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Gracias a todos.
Gracias.
Chao.
Nos salimos, ¿verdad?
Pues
Nos
sí,
salimos,
estoy esperando que nos desconecten.
Sí.
No sé si ya pasó o no.
Bueno,
Sí.
igual a lo mejor sí. Chao. Muchas gracias.
Chao.
Buen día.